Hey there YouTube lovers, my name is BB8 and today I am going to rank every single Donkey Kong game from worst to best. Alright, so with the release of Donkey Kong Country Returns HD in January, I thought since I finally got to play it, I could now officially rank all of the Donkey Kong games from worst to best. Since Donkey Kong has always been one of those franchises that's inconsistent with each release. So I thought Donkey Kong would make a perfect ranking, and this ranking includes all the arcade Donkey Kong games, all the Donkey Kong Country games, all of the Mario vs. Donkey Kong games, and Donkey Kong Barrel Blast. The only games I can confirm are not included on my ranking are Donkey Konga, since Donkey Kong 3 is a Japanese exclusive, but I still included Jungle Beat in the ranking. All of the Game & Watch Donkey Kong games have been ruled out, and Diddy Kong Racing and Diddy Kong Racing DS. So, without further ado, let's get into it, shall we? Alright, so for the last place spot on this list, usually from the start of my updated Sonic ranking, I would do some sort of like drum roll reveal for which game would end up being last place. But I think with Donkey Kong, my last place spot shouldn't really be a surprise to anyone, since my ranking videos in the past have had unusual picks for last place, such as the Game Boy Advance version of Sonic 1 in my updated Sonic ranking, and my Pokemon ranking with Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl. But here, with my Donkey Kong ranking, this may be one of the most agreed upon last place slots there's ever been on my channel, since every Donkey Kong ranking I've looked at online from Nintendo Life, Polygon, IMDb, and even YouTube channels like 1UP Binge and Mojo Plays, all 5 of the sources I've brought up have this game in last place. And that, of course, is one of my least favorite Nintendo games of all time. Say hello to my least favorite game in the whole Donkey Kong franchise, Donkey Kong Jr. Math. But why is Donkey Kong Jr. Math so bad? I'm sorry to say this to anyone who even liked Junior Math, but it doesn't even qualify as a game at all, but more like a gamified calculator. Instead of the platforming, like the rest of the Donkey Kong games, you're just solving maths problems while climbing vines, which is just Donkey Kong Jr. if it was boring. And even as a game that was designed for educational purposes, it fails terribly. The gameplay is repetitive, and the controls haven't held up very well, but if I'm being honest, the NES has better games to choose from than Donkey Kong Jr. Math, such as Mario Bros. Or Excitebike. Donkey Kong Jr. Math being in my top 10 worst Nintendo games of all time proves that I do not have a bias towards Nintendo when it comes to liking games. Number 24, Mini Mario and Friends Amiibo Challenge. If the last place pick was easy, then Mini Mario and Friends Amiibo Challenge wasn't that far off. I feel like this game is forgotten not just by the public, but Nintendo themselves as well. But I don't really blame them for forgetting about this game. It's just a downscaled Mario vs. Donkey Kong game, and the worst part of the game is that most of the game is locked behind Amiibo, which is a big problem I've had with Animal Crossing Amiibo Festival, which you are required to scan in Amiibo before even gaining access to levels at all, which does make Mini Mario and Friends Amiibo Challenge an expensive option for completionists. Unlike other Mario vs. Donkey Kong titles, at least you have the full experience right there out of the box. This one, on the other hand, feels more like a tech demo for what Amiibo could do. And to be fair, the gameplay itself wasn't bad. I just feel like it didn't do anything special to make it stand out to me. And that's why I feel like this was an easy pick for the F tier because of it. Number 23, Donkey Kong Barrel Blast. If I had to say one Donkey Kong game sounded fun from its concept, but wasn't good at all, it's Donkey Kong Barrel Blast. This was originally supposed to be on the GameCube, where you would use the bongos as the controllers, but when the development transferred over to the Wii, it all went downhill from there. The controls are undeniably the worst part of the game, since instead of using normal racing controls, you have to shake both the Wii remote and the nunchuck up and down to even accelerate, making Barrel Blast an exhausting game to play. Compare this to Mario Kart Wii, which released around the same time as Barrel Blast, and handled motion controls way better than Barrel Blast did. It's not hard to see why people forgot about Barrel Blast. And to be fair, there were a few elements of quality that did spare Barrel Blast from being a 1 out of 10 Donkey Kong racing game, since Barrel Blast was not bad in concept, it just wasn't executed well. The roster was solid, the visuals were pretty good for a Wii game, and the soundtrack is pretty underrated. That's pretty much everything positive I have to say about Donkey Kong Barrel Blast. But other than that, the courses are forgettable and the gameplay is more exhausting than engaging to play. And if I had to recommend one racing game from the Wii that you could play instead of Barrel Blast, it's Mario Kart Wii and the underrated Excitebots. And is it just me, or should they have just used the barrels from Donkey Kong Country Returns and made a racing game out of that? I mean, hopefully that would have made a better Donkey Kong racing game, but let's move on with the video now. Now, those are the only 3 F tiers on the list. Now we move on to the only D tier on the list, with number 22, Donkey Kong 3. This one does stand out to me for a few wrong reasons. Originally released in 1983, this is the first Donkey Kong game to break free from the platforming formula as seen in Donkey Kong Jr. and the original Donkey Kong game, since the game involves Stanley the Bugman defending himself from hordes of bugs and, of course, Donkey Kong. This shift in gameplay just doesn't make this very appealing to play and takes away what made Donkey Kong Donkey Kong. But wait, didn't Donkey Kong Country go off gameplay from the originals too? Well, yes. But that's a different argument, since it managed to keep the identity of the Donkey Kong franchise alive while trying something exciting by allowing you to play as Donkey Kong. But Donkey Kong 3, on the other hand, feels more like an experimental game that would have worked better as an original game and not related to Donkey Kong at all. Okay, so Donkey Kong 3 was the only D tier on the list. And now we move on to the C tiers with number 21, Donkey Kong Jr. Now let's move on from the more mediocre and start looking at the ones that are at least okay. Donkey Kong Jr. released in 1982 and is an interesting installment in the Donkey Kong series, and while not a groundbreaking game, it still works well as an arcade game, and I was heavily interested in how they flipped the script from the original Donkey Kong game and made Donkey Kong Jr. the hero and Mario the villain. And unlike Donkey Kong 3, it still has platforming elements in there, but they made the platforming different by adapting to Donkey Kong Jr.'s moveset. And if you are looking for a time killer, Donkey Kong Jr. is not a bad choice, even if it doesn't reach the heights of the original Donkey Kong game. Number 20, DK Jungle Climber. Jungle Climber from the DS is one of those interesting ones, since this, for me, falls as okay, but not amazing. While it can get fun at times, it's not there with some of the best of the Donkey Kong series. It is noticeable that this is a sequel to DK King of Swing from the Game Boy Advance, bringing back the climbing mechanic from that game, but this time with the stylus involved. I didn't find Jungle Climber to be a game that is innovative in any way, but I still think it does provide an okay experience for those who are looking for a DK game on the Nintendo DS. Number 19, Mario vs. Donkey Kong, the 2024 remake. As the newest installment in the Mario vs. Donkey Kong series, the 2024 remake of the Game Boy Advance original had the potential to completely modernize it, but this was just a remake that didn't feel necessary at all. I mean, it wasn't a bad remake, I just feel like there wasn't enough for this remake to even justify its existence, such as the lack of new things to do, and I feel like the original could have been brought over to GBA NSO instead of a remake happening. I mean, it was a fun remake, but I feel like this one is gonna be forgotten by many people. And now, we have the honor of being the first ever joint placement in my ranking videos before. Not one, not two, but 3 different games share this spot, with number 18, 17, and 16 Donkey Kong Land 1, 2, and 3. Normally, I would rank games separately, but in the case of the Donkey Kong Land trilogy, it does make sense to talk about all of them together. Not just to avoid repeating myself, it's also because all 3 of them are 6 out of 10 games. These games, which were aimed to bring the Donkey Kong Country experience to the Game Boy, were ambitious when they first came out, but in comparison to Donkey Kong Country on the SNES, they're not quite there. And I do understand that the visuals may not be up there with Donkey Kong Country because they all released on the Game Boy, but the main issue I have with the visuals of Donkey Kong Land is that things can become hard to see, especially with the 4-color limit on the Game Boy Color. While I did enjoy the platforming and music of the Donkey Kong Land trilogy, I just feel like Donkey Kong Country did it better than Donkey Kong Land. Number 15, Mario vs. Donkey Kong Minis March Again. While I didn't think Minis March Again was a bad game, there wasn't that much to it to make it stand out to me. It was a DSiWare title after all, meaning that the experience wasn't that big in comparison to a full-sized entry. The core gameplay was still solid since it manages to keep the puzzle platforming mechanics from other Mario vs. Donkey Kong games, but Minis March Again feels more like DLC for March of the Minis than a standalone game. The level editor in it was great since it added more replayability to the game, but the recycled ideas from past installments prevent the game from ranking higher. It is a fun installment, but not impactful unlike March of the Minis. Now we're moving on from the C tiers, and it's time for the B tiers with number 14, Donkey Kong Jungle Beat. Jungle Beat is one of those Donkey Kong games I find unique from the rest of the Donkey Kong games thanks to the bongo gimmick. Unlike other Donkey Kong games, Jungle Beat focuses more on the rhythm than the platforming. The game, however, is too short, and relying on the bongos to play the game may not be everybody's cup of tea, which I do understand, but some may argue, like myself, that the bongos actually did make Donkey Kong Jungle Beat a more unique experience. Number 13, DK King of Swing. DK King of Swing is one that does take a unique approach from the Donkey Kong games thanks to its swinging mechanic instead of running and jumping like in the Donkey Kong Country games. But King of Swing has players grabbing onto 2 different parts of the level and using buttons to navigate through the levels by climbing, and while I do think this twist is interesting, I do think the controls get awkward sometimes. The game does have a charming art style and the boss battles are fun, but however, the pacing of the game compared to all the other Donkey Kong games does bring it down a bit. I mean, this is a solid experiment, but I don't think DK King of Swing is one you need to play immediately. Number 12, Mario vs. Donkey Kong Tipping Stars. Tipping Stars does follow the same formula as past Mario vs. Donkey Kong games, but does introduce the Tipping Star system, which allows people to share custom levels. It does play well and does keep the classic mini Mario puzzle solving gameplay intact, but I just don't feel like Tipping Stars was big enough of a leap from other Mario vs. Donkey Kong games. The level editor in it was fun, although it did rely heavily on community levels. The visuals and the music were great, but there was nothing outstanding about Tipping Stars. It's a good game, but ultimately feels more of the same of other Donkey Kong games such as March of the Minis and Mario vs. Donkey Kong. Speaking of which, number 11, Mario vs. Donkey Kong, the original from 2004. The original Mario vs. Donkey Kong from 2004 does bring back the gameplay style of Donkey Kong 1994, which does blend puzzle solving with platforming as seen in all the other Donkey Kong games, and unlike all the entries which heavily focused on Mini Mario, this game allowed you to control Mario directly, which did make Mario vs. Donkey Kong feel more dynamic than the others. The level design is great with clever puzzles implemented throughout the levels. The game does feature some fun boss fights that would be a bit challenging, but I just feel like Mario vs. Donkey Kong was a bit too easy for me. But later installments do tend to take the shift away from how the original Mario vs. Donkey Kong played out. And while Mario vs. Donkey Kong felt more like a standalone experiment for what could actually happen in the future, it's still a solid platformer and better than the 2024 remake. Now, we're moving on from the B tiers and on to the A tiers with number 10, Donkey Kong 1981. The original Donkey Kong game from 1981 still serves as one of the most important games of all time, introducing Mario and kicking off Nintendo's dominance in the gaming market. The gameplay is simple, but does bring in quite a challenge, requiring players to time their jumps correctly, and while it may seem dated in comparison to modern games, Donkey Kong 1981 still holds up as a classic that I will respect until the end of time. The level design is so iconic, with each stage offering a slightly different challenge to offer, and the game's legacy is kind of undeniable at this rate. And even here in 2025, I still think the original Donkey Kong is fun. Number 9. Donkey Kong 1994. This game from the Game Boy does take the original Donkey Kong arcade game and expands on it with more levels, and after completing the original 4 from the arcade game, the game would introduce some new mechanics like handstands, backflips, and key-based puzzles, which would all be implemented into Mario vs. Donkey Kong later on. The level variety in it is fantastic, constantly keeping the gameplay fresh with the variety of new challenges to offer and I feel like that this is one of the best offerings from the Game Boy, offering a surprisingly good experience. The controls are really good and the puzzle design is really satisfying to play. And while often forgotten, Donkey Kong 1994 I feel like is one of the most underrated Donkey Kong games in the whole series. Number 8, Mario vs. Donkey Kong Mini Land Mayhem. Mini Land Mayhem is one of the best entries in the Mario vs. Donkey Kong series, which does rework the Mario vs. Donkey Kong formula to its best. The levels are well designed, which does require the player to think strategically to help them guide the minis to safety, and the introduction of new mechanics such as the conveyor belt and moving platforms does make the gameplay more engaging, and the difficulty is balanced very nicely, making this one of the most challenging games in the Mario vs. Donkey Kong series. Number 7, Mario vs. Donkey Kong March of the Minis. Being the best entry in the Mario vs. Donkey Kong series, it does move away from the platforming playstyle, which I didn't mind because this came out on the Nintendo DS, but if March of the Minis were to release on a modern console, I don't think the game would have worked very well. But other than that, in March of the Minis, you guide a bunch of mini Marios through a whole bunch of levels with obstacles in it, and I do think the concept of March of the Minis is well executed. Though the level design was a bit tight, it still manages to keep the gameplay engaging as well. And this is where the rivalry against Mario and Donkey Kong over Pauline was introduced, which does add a bit of flair that the touchscreen controls did work very well, making it feel like a game that needs to be played. And I would go as far to say that this is one of the best puzzle offerings from the Nintendo DS. Number 6, Donkey Kong Country. The game that completely redefined Donkey Kong as a franchise for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. Donkey Kong Country was groundbreaking when it first launched on the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. The graphics were amazing, the first time it released, and it still is today. The gameplay is very satisfying to play, and the level variety in it was great, consisting of underwater stages, minecart levels, and barrel blasting sections. The soundtrack composed by BB8's was excellent, with tracks consisting of aquatic ambiance still being praised to this day, and I can't deny that. However, I do feel like some of the platforming areas were a bit rough compared to its sequels. But despite that, Donkey Kong Country is one of the best platformers to come out on the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. Number 5. Donkey Kong 3, Dixie Kong's Double Trouble. Probably the most underrated in the Donkey Kong Country trilogy, but Donkey Kong Country 3 did have a big impact on the gameplay, with some new mechanics being brought into the mix as well, with Dixie and Kiddy Kong teaming up to bringing some fresh new opportunities within the gameplay, with some unique abilities, which did make for some great level design. And I do feel like that Donkey Kong Country 3 had some of the best overworld exploration in the trilogy. The visuals were still great, like the other two installments, so is the soundtrack. And while the soundtrack is different to Donkey Kong Country 2, I still think the score in Donkey Kong Country 3 is excellent, like the other two installments. But I still think that Donkey Kong Country 3 is a great game despite it being underrated. Number 4. Donkey Kong 64. Woo! Yeah! Donkey Kong 64! Let's go! Chunky Kong! Yeah! DK! Donkey Kong! He's the leader of the bunch! You know him well! He's finally back to kick some tail! I really just added that in there for comedic effect. But in all seriousness, I feel like Donkey Kong 64 is one of the most ambitious in the whole franchise, which does bring Donkey Kong to 3D platforming. The game does feature 5 playable Kongs, with each having their own unique abilities, with a lot to collect. I feel like some people would criticize Donkey Kong 64 for being too bloated, but I feel like for the time it came out, the amount of content in it is impressive. The level design is varied and does offer a fair mix of platforming puzzles and mini-games, and the multiplayer was a fun addition into the mix as well. And while it may not be up there with Super Mario 64 or Banjo-Kazooie, I still think Donkey Kong 64 is a memorable Donkey Kong game. Number 3. Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze. Tropical Freeze was a platforming treat by improving what made Donkey Kong Country Returns a great game while also improving on the depth. The level design in the the level design in the game was brilliant, packed with a lot of creativity, with each of the worlds having their own unique platforming elements. And the secret paths do improve on the experience as well. And with the addition of Dixie Kong and Cranky Kong, there's more you can do to find specific objects within the levels. And Funky Kong does make the Switch version of the game more accessible as well. And the soundtrack by BB8's was excellent again, but other than that, the game is visually stunning. With detailed environments and well thought out animations, I feel like Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze is one of the greatest in the Donkey Kong series. And now, to conclude the video, we're moving on from the A tiers and ending it off with the 2 S tiers, with number 2, Donkey Kong Country Returns. Donkey Kong Country Returns is definitely an amazing revival of the Donkey Kong platforming formula, thanks to how fast-paced the gameplay is. The level design's amazing, and the amount of challenge provided in there is top-notch. And Retro Studios definitely did do an amazing job by capturing the SNES classics while making the movesets more complex compared to the originals. And while I do prefer the Wii version of Donkey Kong Country Returns in comparison to its other 2 versions consisting of the 3DS version, which did sacrifice the visuals to get it to run on the 3DS, with the HD remaster going ahead and making the experience more improved for handhelds, I still think Donkey Kong Country Returns is still one that's worth the play, no matter how you play it. I do feel like the boss design was way better in Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze, but Donkey Kong Country Returns had a better soundtrack in my opinion. I mean, to be fair, both were composed by David Wise, but Donkey Kong Country Returns definitely felt more authentic to the original Donkey Kong Country games, and that is what makes Donkey Kong Country Returns so special. Number 1, Donkey Kong Country 2, Dizzy Kong's Quest. At the top of my list is none other than Donkey Kong Country 2, Dizzy Kong's Quest. While the first Donkey Kong game did lay out the foundation for how Donkey Kong Country would play out in the future, its sequel did improve on the level design as well as the movesets. And I do think this is the most creative platforming in the Donkey Kong trilogy, thanks to the tag team consisting of Dizzy Kong and Dixie Kong, making it feel more smooth and respond to control compared to Donkey Kong and Dizzy Kong in Donkey Kong Country 1. The game did introduce some of the best animal buddies in the whole series, such as Squitter and Rattly, who do provide some unique mechanics into the mix as well. And this is Donkey Kong at its best, and I don't see any other Donkey Kong game taking its spot anytime soon, because Donkey Kong Country 2 Dizzy Kong's Quest may hold the spot for a while now. So guys, what did you think of my overall Donkey Kong ranking? And I want to hear from you. What ranking do you want to see on the channel next? Because I do have loads of rankings on the table. I'm hoping to get The Legend of Zelda and Metroid done this year. If not, there's always Pokemon Mystery Dungeon. I'm playing through Red Rescue Team at the moment, so I could rank the Pokemon Mystery Dungeon game soon. We'll just have to wait and see. So, don't forget to subscribe to my channel, like this video, and turn your notification bell on so you don't miss another video like this one in the future. And I will see you all in a future video. BB8 out.